3 million soldiers in the opening stages of Operation Barbarossa. And or Soviet soldiers kill and capture them all and not win the war, when they weren't fighting a two-front war like they were in World War I or II, or in World War I. And it's because of Babin Yar. 9 and 30 September in 1940, after they captured Kiev, the Germans round up the entire Jewish population of Kiev that's still there and kill them. Liberated is, why do you think the Russians can't fight effectively? Because they have to control massive lines of communication where the population hates them. They have to play policeman and soldier. And I've done that in Iraq, and it's not fun. So these three operations, you have the offensive big operation like the Battle of Kiev and these big operations, Stalingrad being the classic iconic defensive operation of World War II, which is probably a lot like the Battle of Mariupol. And, the fact that it created this huge legend within both militaries that still, I think to this day, rallies the Soviet descendants, the Russian army and the Ukrainian army. What happened in Mariupol and the legendary defense of that garrison, which we'll talk about, is going to create myths that will power, a new national history for not just the military, but the whole country. And then finally, raids are attacks, point attacks in territories that you may or may not control completely behind enemy lines or in your own territories. In Iraq, we theoretically controlled a lot of areas. We'd have to do raids to clean out people who are fighting against us. That's what the Russians did. And you're raiding someone else in a territory you think you control is absolutely what bled the German military dry in World War II, was the amount of troops they had to commit to securing their rear areas on the Eastern Front, and the amount of troops, because Hitler lost the story. And the story was that you guys are worse to me than Stalin, whatever. I'm going to treat you worse than Stalin, okay? Just letting you know. That story didn't work. Ukrainians fought really hard, not just against Germany, but also Stalin too, because they didn't want to be controlled by either one. But they had far more of an effect on the German military in that regard, and played a huge part in the defeat of the German military. So if you look at the offensive, this is General Zelensky in Izium. I remember talking to American analysts, policymakers before the offensive happened. I know some people that work in the White House, and some of the top analysts of the Ukrainian military in America that the policymakers and politicians listen to on a regular basis, and they all had this really big concern before the offensive in Kherson that's happening right now. Can Ukraine pull off an effective offensive? Because we've been giving you all these weapons, and don't you think you should wait until you're better trained, and maybe you don't need to do it as soon as you think? There's this huge debate with the Ukrainian military, the American military, and it's now coming out. Ukraine had really ambitious plans, and U.S. military was saying, we don't think you can accomplish that in terms of the scale of the offensive they wanted to do. And they decided to pare back their offensive goals to Kherson, but General Sikorsky here, the land forces commander, apparently he had an idea that, okay, well, we can't do this big offensive we want to do all across the southern front in Zaporizhia and Kherson. We'll just do it in Kherson, but we got to do something somewhere else. And we need to have this big narrative around, and I remember at the time thinking, you guys are making it really obvious you're about to attack in Kherson, and Russia started to move troops all the way down from Kharkiv, from Donbass, all the way into Kherson. And, everyone was saying, what's going on here? Like, this doesn't make a lot of sense. And then Ukraine ends up replicating, about 7 or 8 days after the Kherson offensive starts, they do the Battle of Izium, which is a complete replica of a 1942 campaign of the German army in Ukraine called Operation Citadel, where the Germans surrounded, I think, 4 Soviet armies, or 3 or 4 armies in that area on the exact same terrain, on the Osokol River. And Ukraine basically replicated an old battlefield playbook. I can't wait to speak to General Sikorsky one of these days after the war and interview him and ask him, did you dust off the old history book plans or not? But they saw the terrain and it was obvious. And they created, with this offensive, this lightning assault, which people had assumed, because of the way the war was going, that the Russians and the Ukrainians were just going to have this trench warfare over and over, and it was there. The maneuver warfare wasn't going to happen anymore. And Ukraine completely blew that out of the water with the success of the Izium offensive. And you see now, as of 3 October, Lyman just fell, and now they're moving back into territories that Russia spent months conquering in a matter of weeks. And what's happening because of this offensive? The West is now completely blown away. They're in like envy of Ukraine, and you have American army officers saying, man, I've never had a chance to do something cool like that in my career because we've just been fighting, and Ukraine knew, despite our fears of, oh, we really hope you don't screw up this offensive, because if you do, we're not going to give you any more weapons because we can't sell it to our public. But Ukraine also knew that they had to come up with something to change the narrative of the war, which is a successful offensive. And General Sikorsky had a lot of pushback from the rest of the staff, apparently. I can't wait to dig in and interview all these people and get that background. But he won the day. They took a big risk, and it paid off. Even, I think it exceeded their wildest expectations in terms of speed and the impact and the effect it's had. And what has it done? It's forced Russia basically to go all in and try to change the narrative of the war with a mobilization that we all know is going to be impactful in some way. We don't know how it's going to play out. But that's how powerful offensive operations are and can be. And Ukraine knew that they had to be successful. You couldn't mess this one up. And, oh, sorry, that's not Hitler visiting the German headquarters. That's, let me delete that because that's other text there. But you guys have, this is, I don't know his name, Mihailo, yeah. He's a pianist who was in the Azovstal plant at the garrison defending, and this is one of the iconic pictures. You've seen many of the pictures from the Azovstal defenders, and these guys not only tied down several 10,000+ of Russia's best troops for 8 weeks of the war, which could have probably destroyed the Ukrainian military in the Donbass if they weren't tied down in Mariupol. But more importantly, the story that got out with Starlink, and thanks to Elon Musk, and their regular broadcasts, the images that they sent out created a legend, right? And this defense, even though they had to surrender and many of them were tortured and killed in captivity, this garrison that has now seen its leaders released and several of them released, they're going to live to create a legend, right? They're going to live to create that story. And I remember President Zelensky, when he told them to lay down arms, he said, and they were following orders. They were willing to die to the last person, but then the national leadership made a decision, okay, you can't really do much more given all the situation, the resupplies, whatever military calculus came into it. President Zelensky, the last leadership, said, your job now is to live, right? Those are your new orders. Go into captivity and live through this, because, and he said, your lives are more important, and I think more importantly, their story about what happened is critical to the future of Ukraine. And the stories that these people are going to tell, that they're already telling on social media, the pictures afterwards when he's released of his arm, and some of the interviews. Aidan Aislinn, another guy who's a Marine, a British Marine, British volunteer who joined the several years ago joined the Ukrainian Marines. He's been released also. They're talking, and their stories about what's happened and their release, the story around their release in Russia did not go down well. These guys are Nazis. Why are we releasing them? Right? But President Zelensky managed to, with his sales and marketing ability and getting Saudi princes and oligarchs involved from Russia, was able to get that deal done. That was a huge morale boost for Ukraine and a huge absolute body blow to the nationalists on the Russian side, who are furious with President Putin for trading prisoners to get these guys out. You know who they got? They got Medvedev. I mean, they got that guy back, right? Putin's, basically mole or traitor or president in waiting for Ukraine, which is the godfather of his daughter, who's completely useless now to him. Well, maybe in his mythical, strange mind of what might happen, maybe he thinks he can install Medvedev in Ukraine in the future as a president, but this guy is dead. He's dead politically in Ukraine. But that is an amazing story, and it's the story of what they did and the way they got their story out and the way they're going to tell it afterwards, which is everything. Now, I don't have a lot of stories about the raids that are going on, except for ones that make it into the news. This is my favorite. Watching Russian sunbathers run after the Saki Air Base in Crimea is destroyed. And this was right before the events have started. This was actually when Ukraine was in a real low moment, I think. The casualties just were really bad in the early parts of the summer. There was no sign that the offensive was about to start. And all of a sudden, the Saki Air Base in Crimea gets blown up. And I think recently the President Zelensky's admitted that it was some kind of strike. He's been very vague on what it is, but Ukraine is responsible for this. Whether it's special forces who were observing or did some attack with some suicide drones or kamikaze drones, or it was a long-range weapon, the fact that it happened, and you have Russian tourists running back and crying on social media about Ukraine vacation being, or their Crimea vacation being ruined, it has a huge impact on the national psyche of both countries. And these kind of raids, I remember when Osama bin Laden was killed in Afghanistan, or Saddam Hussein was captured, or these big leaders that were killed in Iraq. And we actually, in my own unit, we killed a large, in a raid, we had our own incident where we killed a leader who, when he was killed, it made it on Iraqi national TV. They have a huge psychological impact when generals or leaders or high-value targets are killed. And these high-end raids can make national news. They can change the mood of the war. They can change support for the war. Raids can be very big. I mean, these could be huge Cossack raiding parties from Zaporizhia, in the 1700s, they had huge raiding parties, right? These can be big or small. But raids are different than offensives and defensive operations, because those are typically very large and have many people involved. These can have not a lot of people involved, but can have huge strategic, operational, and tactical significance. So let's talk about Ukraine and your history, because this is what I think is most important about this war, is Ukraine deserves a better history. Now, I have two friends, and I'm gonna say both of their names because they both know who they are. And if they watch this, I'll get a chuckle out of it. And I have two friends from Ukraine, both good friends of mine, and I don't want them to meet. Okay, because Yuri, he's from Zhytomyr, grew up speaking Russian, served in Ukrainian military, and I like to go running with him. He was one of the first people I met when I came to Ukraine. We were born in the same year, 5 days apart, and grew up speaking Russian, but 2014, actually during the Orange Revolution, and especially after 2014, he only speaks Ukrainian to his children. And he likes Stepan Bandera, and he thinks Stepan Bandera is a great national hero for Ukraine, all right? And my other friend who lives in Kiev, he hates Bandera. Okay, he can't stand this guy. And he said he killed a bunch of Jews and Poles, and what he stands for, I think, is ripping Ukraine apart. Now, how much of that is true versus, Putin-inspired mythology about Bandera? I personally haven't read enough about him and done enough historical research about him, so I'm actually speaking honestly about my historical knowledge on him. But I do know this: he's controversial. And I do know that when you say his name in Germany and Poland, you don't get a good reaction, especially when the German ambassador for Ukraine to Germany is praising Bandera in Germany. It's not a good unifying thing. Whether or not that's fair to him or not, and to what he did, it's just the reality. And on the other side is the Ukrainian First Army, this is on Victory Day in June of 1945. These are the Red Army soldiers that made it all the way into Berlin, and actually there's a bunch of Ukrainian graffiti still in the Reichstag, or the Parliament building in Germany that's still preserved, because Ukrainians were that prominent in the Red Army in terms of, I don't think Russia's ever won or will win a major war in the future without Ukrainians on their side, right? Because they're the best part of any Russian military campaign, are the Ukrainians. And, my wife, Katya, I remember on social media a few years ago on Victory Day, her mother posts a post about her great-grandfather who was with the Ukrainian First Army that went into Berlin. And what I wouldn't pay to speak to him if I had the opportunity and understand what he saw and what he went through, right? But those stories live inside of, the family that he passed down. They're part of the DNA, whether you tell them or not. They're part of the DNA that you give to your children. So I'll have some of that coming from my children, I'm sure, because that's a very intense historical experience that's part of the Ukrainian history. Like it or not, sometimes when I talk to Ukrainians, I feel like you're like a child of two divorced parents, and you spent a while living with your mom, Poland and the great Lithuanian Commonwealth, and she was okay, but she did some stuff that you didn't like, and then you went and lived with your abusive alcoholic father, Russia, for a while, right? And it's like you're angry about both of these things in different ways. Bogdan Khmelnytsky, like, he fights back against the Poles and gets your freedom, and then Russia betrays you, and then all of a sudden you don't have your freedom, and you end up fighting in all these wars that weren't necessarily your own choice, and having really horrible leaders, who didn't treat Ukrainians that well. But that's what makes Ukraine such a tough country right now, right? And I think my wish for Ukraine is that we can get past this divisive history and not demonize either side, but acknowledge the good and the bad that you got from each side, the European side of your history, the Russian side of your history. I mean, Katya's mom teaches Russian literature, or she did, right? Because now that's not taught in schools. But think about all the contribution that Ukraine's made to Russian literature, to the intelligentsia. Some of that great literature that came from Ukrainians, Gogol, and the impact that Ukrainians had on Russian thought and Russian civilization, whatever you call Russian civilization, is, I think, very powerful. And to disown that history and some of the accomplishments Ukrainians made inside the Russian Empire, I think is tragic. And I think it's not serving your national identity going forward. And what this war gives you, as horrible as war is, in terms of the human cost, is it gives you an opportunity to finally unify this history. And you have, rather than thinking of yourselves as some child of divorced parents who both have their flaws, Europe and Russia, let's flip the script and let's start imagining that, Yaroslav the Wise was actually the godfather of Europe. All of his daughters went out and taught the French to bathe and to read, and really was the wealthiest empire of Europe at that time, and made a huge impact on European history before some bad times came upon it in terms of Ukraine's decentralized nature, which had some strengths and weaknesses, and its early gifts to European civilization. You created Russia, and you know that. I mean, they came from Ukrainian civilization, and Europe was greatly impacted by Ukrainian civilization. And then you have Bogdan Khmelnytsky, who created with the Cossacks, and this is where Kiev-Mohylanska gets its heritage from, this time period, this idea that we're going to live free. And the first real free communities in Europe that demanded and created a written constitution came in Ukraine with Pep Orlak. And that tradition in Ukraine, it's not about whether you speak Ukrainian, it's not about whether you speak Russian, it's not about any of that. It's really about, I think, a higher ideal. And what Ukraine has, I remember when I came to the square, the trade union house in 2014 was burned down, and they had this, they were rebuilding it for several years, and on the building it said, "Freedom is our religion." And that sign always had a big impact on me, because that's what I think Ukraine has that can unify these two different sides of Ukraine. There's this, my friend Platon, who doesn't like Bandera, but has volunteered a ton since the war started to help the Ukrainian military and done a lot of stuff, and his family's donated a lot of money. He says it very well. He says, all these Russian speakers in the East who've been told that they're not real Ukrainians because they don't speak Ukrainian at home, they're the ones suffering the most. And they're the ones fighting for Ukraine, and they're the only reason that Ukraine still exists as a state. So let's stop criticizing them and telling them because of their language they're not real Ukrainians. And my wife, she grew up speaking Russian, but she speaks Ukrainian now with her best friend, and it's funny for both of them, but they're really getting used to it and getting into it. It's not like a lot of people who grew up in those parts of Ukraine don't want to, now be more Ukrainian in terms of maybe their language or some other traditions. But you shouldn't ask them to disown that part of themselves that comes from Russian civilization that's stronger in the East. And this war gives Ukraine, I think, a unique opportunity to create this history that transcends a specific language. And yes, Ukrainian should be the national language of Ukraine. Everyone should learn it. I'm not saying, it's not important for a state to have that, but you have a lot of people, my friend Steve here, who's moved to Ukraine from the United States, myself, who are moving here, and they're drawn to this country because you've showed us all something. I think Americans are secretly jealous. We're like that old flabby athlete, and Ukraine's like this young, superstar rising up, showing us what freedom's all about, and that's what we were founded on. Same thing with Britain. I think Britain and America, especially, some of your biggest fans, they're like this old kind of washed up democracy that's trying to figure out if they still have it. And you have the opportunity, we in Ukraine, with people from all over the world who don't speak Ukrainian, who are from the West, who are going to come here, and they're going to want a lot of things in English, right? And they should learn Ukrainian. A lot of them will, some never will. But you're going to have this strange phenomenon where people from all over the world are going to want to come visit Ukraine. They might stay here because they fall in love with the country when they come here. And you're going to have this, you can't afford to just, if you don't speak Ukrainian and you don't eat borscht and all this kind of stuff, then you're not Ukrainian.
I like borscht.
Yeah, I know, but you got to have the right woman cook it for you. But yes, you're right. But Ukraine has this opportunity to be something far more than you've ever imagined. And that's what I'd like us all to take from this course, is the stories we tell ourselves about this war, the stories we share with our friends about what we see on social media, the stories you have if you participated as a soldier, as a volunteer. All of that's important, because if you tell those stories to people who didn't experience it, who come after us, or who are watching it from far away and decide to help Ukraine, or tell their politicians in their country to help Ukraine, it's going to make a difference. And people in America are, the more they get to know Ukraine, or people who've been here like Steve and I, they're just becoming bigger and bigger fans. And that's the opportunity here, is to become what America once was and is trying to regain, and I think living vicariously through Ukraine by supporting you, and thinking bigger than the past disagreements over history. And I think President Zelensky has made a lot of mistakes in the war, and he would admit he's not perfect. And after the war, there's going to be a political scramble, and people are going to attack him for mistakes he made. He may or may not get reelected. But what Ukraine can't go back to, and what it should not allow itself to do, is just tearing ourselves apart about a history that, you know, we have a unifying history now. And people from the East who don't speak Ukrainian at home are sacrificing for the entire country, and people from the West who speak Ukrainian are going out and volunteering and taking in people from the East. And, you know, this is not a real opportunity. And if you squander, and I say we because Ukraine is where I want to live and raise my family, it's going to be a real tragedy. And that's really the opportunity that's been presented here. And you as journalism students, as future journalists, leaders in Ukrainian society, Kiev Mohylanska is like the intelligentsia of Ukraine, comes from here, right? What kind of stories are you going to tell as politicians, as leaders? Are you going to tear each other apart because you didn't go to Kiev Mohylanska and you're not Ukrainian enough, right? You guys have a reputation, okay? You went to Taras Shevchenko, that's not cool enough, right? Or oh, you went to somewhere out east, you must be, you know, really bad, right? So we have a choice to make, and this is exactly why I'm teaching this course. What if this is the greatest story that's ever told, and the story's not over? President Zelensky on 22 August, he's really good at this stuff. He had a parade of Russian tanks that were supposed to be parading down Krashatik, and you know, he gave his talk on 22 August. And there's a lot of, this war's not over yet, and we know that it could be a lot worse for Ukraine. I think Ukraine definitely is going to win, but the question still is, what's the cost going to be? And how bad is it going to get? And we have to help write that story by participating in it in all of our small ways. We're not all President Zelensky, who has a huge impact, but everyone knows someone who's fighting, everyone knows someone who's volunteering, everyone's doing their part, and we all have a role to play. And the way you can play a role, if you're watching this, is the reason I'm teaching this course here on war and storytelling at Kiev Mohylanska journalism department is, I'm a historian, but I realize the first draft of history is written by journalists. And when the war started, this is me at the Kiev train station on 22 February, or 12 February, I evacuated my company, which was a tech company I was running. And I knew this was coming because I was watching the intelligence online. And when the war started, I was with Katya, my wife, in Poland, and it immediately became clear to me that I was no longer interested in running a tech company, and I wanted to, in some small way, try and help what's going on. So we started the Borderlands Foundation, which initially was just focused on evacuating people, because we thought that the war was going to be mainly about getting people out, but then Ukraine obviously surpassed all expectations, and a lot of people didn't need to leave. So we formed a nonprofit in America and in Europe. Now we got approved in both America and Europe to be a foundation. And I decided to make it into a historical center. And what I want to create, storytelling center on war and storytelling, is take the framework that I'm teaching here, recruit students to help work in the foundation and help people tell their stories. So what I'd like to do is take Mikhailo and all these people who want to tell their stories and sit them down and interview them and translate those stories into English and put subtitles under them when they're speaking, and put those stories out there and make these stories available for anyone who wants to use them, documentary filmmakers, news media, but basically be a center where people can tell their stories in rich, well lighted, well shot media, so that their story will be remembered. And that's what we're setting up. This is why I'm teaching here, is to help me get the word out about the center, recruit some people who want to help, and tell these stories, and eventually provide material for anyone who wants to write books, whether it's you guys or myself. I've got a few books I'd like to try one of these days, documentary films, or also even after the war, bringing people from all over the world to Ukraine to see what happened here. We call them historical experiences, or in the Army we call them staff rides, where you'd study the battles that happened so you can see what people experienced, meet some of the people who were there, see Ukraine, all these great places I've never been that I can't wait to see, like watermelon country in Kherson, and the great national forests of Izium and Kharkiv and all that area. And show people Ukraine, because I think when people come to Ukraine after 2 weeks, they'll fall in love with the country and want to support it. Donating. The second part of the center. So first is storytelling, documenting stories, putting it out there online, on YouTube, on websites. Second part is histories made by people who sacrificed a lot. So allowing people to donate directly to Mikhailo, the pianist, and give him money, for whatever you want. Give him money for his $2 a month, $100 a month, whatever you want to donate to him for what he did for Ukraine and the world. Directly. We've built the software to allow you to donate directly to anyone who we put on our platform, that we say that this is a real person who we talk to, and they've fought in the war and they've told their story, and here it is, and donate to them. And that's the second part, is supporting the veterans directly. They don't have to be veterans. If it's a family that was impacted by the war, got caught up in it, we'll tell their story too. There's unfortunately plenty of those tragic stories too, but really allowing the people who are most impacted by the war to benefit from people who like this history. And if you're like me and like reading history, you obviously will want to, I think, donate to the people who helped to make that history happen. And then the final part of it is really promoting Ukraine as a country, because ultimately so many people around the world can learn from these battlefield experiences. Military officers, politicians, leaders of any organization could learn leadership lessons from what's happened here. And when they come here, I think they're going to want to open offices in Ukraine, or invest here, or even move here, like Steve and some other people. And that's going to create, for me, my legacy. I think history should be used to make history. History should create a better future. It's going to be a very active historical center that's going to be designed to help policymakers, leaders of Ukraine, go somewhere to learn about what really happened here, contribute to it, draw from that experience, join, pass on their lessons to other people. Look forward to sitting down with President Zelensky, General Sikorsky, General Zaluzny, all these guys, one of these days when they're not busy, and getting them on camera and getting their stories too, to benefit this. So that's the vision. I look forward to sharing with you every week. We'll dive into each principle of war and really analyze each one of them very deeply in subsequent lessons. And I'll keep reminding you who are watching online, or throughout Kiev Mohilanska, we're recruiting. So if you want to be an interviewer, or you're a journalism student, you're going to be, as we said in the Army, voluntold. I'm just going to tell you, you can volunteer. But love to get journalism students practice of interviewing people a lot, because that's where we want to bring in a lot of people to get interviewed. If you're a developer, we need software developers for our software, which we keep developing to give direct donations to people, so software engineers. If you're a sociologist or historian, any of you, we can have you involved in the center. If you can sit down with someone, empathize with them, and shut up and let them tell their story, you'll be useful. So that's who we're recruiting for the center, and I can't wait to work with this great student body that is from the intellectual tradition that created what Ukraine's famous for, freedom and the Cossack spirit in Ukraine and the world. I think the world, everyone's going to become big Ukrainian digital nomad Cossacks are all going to want to come live here and, blockchain and be free and not pay a lot of taxes and live free or die. Those kind of people from all over the world, I think, will come and live in Ukraine and will be the center that helps tell that story. So, well, thank you everyone for joining, and thank you for your attention. And I look forward to sharing with you the rest of the principles of war and getting to know all of you in the coming weeks and months.
Thank you.
All right.
Thank you.